My name is Ben Bengal, and I'm the director of the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on fundraising events and 2020 year-end campaigns. So we have a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we're going to be recording today's webinar, and the recording will be sent to you all by email along with an evaluation form so you can provide feedback about this session. We ask that you please feel free to share that recording with others in your organization who may not be able to attend live right now. We also have everyone on mute, but please feel free to use the Q&A and chat feature built into Zoom. And we're going to save some time at the end of today's presentation to address the questions that you submit. We're going to plan to have about 45 minutes of content today and then reserve about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So with that said, we are really excited to offer this training today. We've heard a number of DCNP members with questions about year-end fundraising, how their events can be reimagined virtually, and people who have been asking for information about their different options and alternatives. And so it's really a true pleasure to welcome Matt Gare to address some of these questions. Matt's the co-executive director of the Catalog for Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofits with a goal to create visibility for these organizations. They try to fuel the growth of these smaller organizations with philanthropic dollars and create a movement for social good in the region. Since 2003, the catalog has raised more than $40 million for their network of vetted nonprofits. Every nonprofit in their network is evaluated for excellence by a team of over 120 local experts, and they assess each organization for impact, community need, and financial transparency. Before joining the catalog, Matt worked in healthcare consulting at the Advisory Board Company. He's a Truman Scholar, holds a Master of Public Administration with a focus in nonprofit management from Syracuse University, and earned a bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Matt loves all things DC and enjoys exploring the hidden gems the city has to offer. Welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and excited to be here with y'all virtually as it is, and to talk a little bit about virtual events and end-of-year fundraising. As Ben just mentioned, the catalog and kind of our role, we work largely with small and medium-sized nonprofits. But some of our partners range up to the 4 to 10 million range that were in the network but still engage. And the things we'll talk about today are really implementable if we're doing our first event ever, virtual or in person, or if we're transitioning a very successful gala that we've been doing for 20 years to virtual for the first time. We also talk about a few trends and also end of year, because we know some overarching kind of themes in philanthropy right now are going to impact the events we're thinking about doing. So in thinking about some of these kind of trends, before we kind of dive into some of the specific event tips and tricks that we'll talk about, we want to say at a high level, we're all kind of in the same boat, right? Everyone's kind of figuring out how to do virtual events, right? Should I be doing a virtual event? What should my goal be for these events? And often I hear people say, while I'm planning my first virtual event, we're pretty much all planning our first virtual events, right? Some of us maybe did some virtual fundraising before, especially if we were a larger organization working across kind of regional areas. But for most of us, our traditional fundraising model included kind of in-person activation, which obviously is less of an option right now. So we're all kind of learning this at the same time. A couple of kind of high-level things, then we're actually going to get a pulse check-in with you all about kind of where you are with your events. Typically, we're recommending to folks and kind of thinking about the fact that across the rest of 2020, kind of regardless of what happens, we don't expect many organizations to be having over 50 people events, right? So kind of large events. We have seen some organizations shift depending on where they are in the country to doing some really small in-person activations. So maybe a group of 10 or 15 socially distanced at a park, maybe like a golf outing, right? A virtual fun run, something like that. But those are still kind of few and far between. So typically speaking, we're seeing folks, if they are going to do a fundraiser, either it's some type of virtual event, right? When we surveyed our partners, we worked with over 400 nonprofits directly in the DC region. Almost 90% have canceled an event due to COVID-19. So not just kind of taking it virtual, but actually just kind of not doing the event at all in 2020. So we know a lot of people have delayed those events, which also means a lot of us have delayed funding that we require, right? And that we kind of bank on and kind of rely on every year. If we are seeing any type of in-person events, they're really small groups, right? They're kind of more like the Fundraiser type model. And we're seeing not a ton of those. So you're not kind of missing out on anything if you're thinking just virtual. That's what the vast majority of organizations we're talking to are thinking about. If we are going to do something small, getting a lot of consent, right? And making sure guests, host, and there's a lot of contingency plans around it. And regardless of what kind of event we're thinking about, we'll talk about some options for events and what we're seeing work well right now. And be a little bit of a struggle, but it's setting a goal, right? So obviously we're gonna have a monetary goal if it is a traditional fundraising type event, right? That we typically would have some type of ask tied to or ticket price tied to, but also that we should have a non-monetary goal, right? So we know back in the world of in-person events, events are actually generally speaking the worst way to raise $1 for your organization. We say that because it's the most expensive. For every dollar you spend on an in-person event, you typically make $1.41 back, which sounds like a great investment, but is actually much less performance than you get from kind of direct mail, major donor, right? Peer-to-peer campaigns, things like that. But most of the time, we're not doing an event just to make money, right? We're doing it to excite our base. We're doing it to get new people in the door, right? Now kind of virtually. But still get new people to pay attention to what we're doing, kind of know about it. We could be wanting to launch a new program, right? Maybe we want to celebrate a success, right? Or celebrate an anniversary, right? And have a win in that way. So usually some type of non-monetary reason. As we shift virtual, it's still really important that we're setting that non-monetary goal, right? So we want to make sure that we're setting not just a goal for how much money we're going to make at our virtual event, but some type of goal for engagement, excitement, acquisition of audience, right? It's something that doesn't just have a dollar sign tied to it. We're going to pause here for a second because I'd love to get a sense from y'all, since you're kind of in the same general area. How many of you have actually canceled events due to COVID or kind of shifted virtual? So if you can take a second to answer that poll. I'll share those results in just a second. As we're waiting for those to come in, and someone was mentioning about kind of going virtual versus canceling, and definitely something we're seeing, right? So, some folks are kind of canceling, some folks are going virtual. We'll look at those results here. We see here, 80%, so kind of right in line with what we're seeing, kind of 80 and 90% canceling. Some of that's going virtual, some of that's postponing until 2021. So we'll talk about kind of both those things a little bit. That's great. Okay. So when we think about making that decision, right? So obviously we're kind of pushing back from our traditional in-person events. So we're thinking about either doing an event virtually or postponing until next year. One of the big things we wanted to highlight quickly at the beginning of today's webinar, which is some of the trends we're seeing in fundraising right now, right? That may influence and impact the choices you're making around holding your event. The first trend we wanted to highlight was around individual donors. So the biggest kind of takeaway from this, none of these stats are foolproof, right? This is based off what we saw happen during the 2008 recession. Also a little bit off anecdotal evidence we're hearing early from some of the nonprofits we work with. But typically we see during a crisis, it isn't like this because it's unprecedented, but from other kind of crisis fundraising or kind of economic recession fundraising, major donors who have given to us for at least a couple of years typically stick around. So we don't typically lose a lot of those donors. So these are folks that, however we define major as an organization, the national average for a major donor is $5,000, but for most of our partners, it's usually 500 or 1,000. But for whatever that level is for you, the vast majority of these folks that have given at that level for at least 2 years keep giving to the organization, right? They were passionate about what we did beforehand. They're still passionate about it now, and especially if we're kind of giving them updates, right, and keeping them involved. So we expect most organizations to retain somewhere in the 80 to 90% range of these folks. A lot of them may not be increasing their gift this year, so it might be flat from the year before. And the good thing for us in terms of projecting total individual donor revenue is that they typically represent about 80% of all of our fundraising, right? So the top 20% of donors typically for an organization represent about 80% of all the money they bring in from individuals. So we know that this is a good base for us to kind of start from. For middle level donors, this is the group that really can benefit from some of your virtual events, because this is the group that really, the more we engage them, the more we're going to keep them. And this is going to be the largest group with kind of variability on terms of how many people keep giving. So these folks that typically on the low end give over $100, either over $100 or $250 is usually where middle level donors start. And if they've given for a couple of years, we're seeing folks kind of, forecast kind of retaining somewhere between 40 and 60% of these folks, right? So definitely know we're going to lose a chunk, and that's either because they might be personally economically impacted by everything going on, or maybe they're shifting their funding given other priorities right now. We also know it's an election year, so in typical, some funding shifts political, right? And that'll be the case this year as well. But that forecast really varies, right? If we think about keeping kind of a little bit more than a third or close to 2/3 of these donors, that's going to make a big difference for us in terms of kind of end of year. So the more we kind of engage them, the more we kind of involve them, invite them to things, invite them to virtual events, even if they don't attend, getting the invite is helpful for their engagement. And then finally, when we think about new and grassroots donors, it's going to be difficult to retain a lot of these. These are folks that are going to be most likely economically impacted by everything going on, or most likely to shift their giving, right? And often though only represents about 5 to 10% of our revenue. So once again, this is what we typically see. Every organization is different. Every donor base is different. We probably have different percentages of how these three things break out in terms of where our kind of money is coming from as a nonprofit, but helpful to think a little bit about. So when crafting our event, right, and how this kind of impacts our virtual event, thinking about which one of these groups am I really focused on, right? And who am I really trying to engage with the event? Am I trying to keep the attention of my middle level donors? Am I trying to kind of reward and thank my major donors? Am I trying to acquire new first time donors or grassroots donors? And that's going to impact kind of our timing of our event, but then also kind of what we put into our kind of virtual event. For foundations, the biggest takeaway here, especially as it relates to events, we need to keep engaged with them, right? Inviting them to events and stuff. A lot of times your program officers aren't going to attend, right? Because they get invited to a lot of things, but it's still good for the relationship to invite, kind of stay active with. And we know a lot of foundations haven't necessarily shifted funding yet, but very well might. We aren't too worried about foundation funding going down much next year. Typically, if we have kind of an economic downturn like we've had with COVID-19, you won't see that hit endowments really until 2022. So the funding will still be there. If the priorities shift or not, it's still a little early to tell. But why we talk about this when talking about kind of fundraising events is just knowing that when we think about all the different ways we kind of raise money for the organizations, foundations are still a little bit of a question mark about anything that might be different next year. And finally, as we get into events themselves, so we'll spend a lot of time kind of talking about some specific tips and tricks here in just a second. At a high level, trend-wise, We're seeing folks, once again, kind of plan virtual through 2020, if not through kind of spring of 2021. Um, if we are booking kind of events for spring, making sure those have really flexible contracts, right? Either not signing and trying to get for right of first refusal, or making sure there's some type of clause that we can get out of this with minimal cost, but not feeling confident about kind of in-person events through April or May of next year. So we might be able to do something sooner, but too early to tell. When people are moving virtual, and we'll talk about these options in more detail in just a second, folks are really thinking about live stream, recorded programming, or a straightforward fundraising campaign, right? And a lot of events are combining the live stream and recorded, so we'll talk about that. Those are really our three options, right? So either we're doing a live virtual event that people are kind of experiencing in the moment, we're creating some recorded content that we're encouraging people to experience at one time, but could be experienced anytime, or we're just kind of ditching the event idea and just trying to do kind of an online fundraising campaign. And one thing I'll note for any of y'all that maybe did a virtual event early on during the pandemic in the spring or summer, or for anyone that attended some of those early ones, in some ways those events had it a bit easier for kind of engagement of their audience. And that was because there wasn't many other options, right, for what folks are going to do in the evening, for instance. So if you're thinking about like a Thursday night event back in kind of, April or May or even June, July, things may not have been open, right? People weren't necessarily going to patios or parks or kind of socially distanced hangouts or things like that. So there is a bit more competition for attention right now. The bar is going to be a little bit higher because people have been to some virtual events. The novelty is definitely worn off. So now people are looking for engagement, not just kind of presence, right? And there is the Zoom fatigue, right? And kind of the fatigue of being on camera, of kind of looking at a screen all day. I will say in general, it's not as bad as we fear it is. So a lot of us, because of the type of work we do, are literally spending all day, right, on camera or looking at a screen, right, staring at our laptop for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. So so when we're doing that, we feel the fatigue. And a lot of times we put that onto our audience that we're inviting. For a lot of folks, they may not be online as much, right, or as virtual. So thinking about that when we think about, is our audience really tired of screens, or is our staff really tired of screens, is a good kind of check to do there. And then finally, being realistic as we set these. So we'll talk about some tips for success here in just a second. But being realistic when we think about our virtual events, in general, we are seeing that they fundraise less, right? Typically how we think about kind of event revenue, sponsorships, and we actually have seen sponsorships hold pretty steady. Obviously, any kind of local businesses or service industry partnerships, those have been really hard hit, just as businesses have been. So that sponsorship has gone down, but sponsorships from major corporations, individual donors, we've seen those remain pretty consistent as folks are trying to kind of keep a somewhat level of support they did before the pandemic. So for at least this year, we have questions about next year, but for this year, we've seen that be pretty consistent. Major donor pre-commitments, right? People who say at the event, I'm going to give $5,000, right? Something like that. Those folks are still kind of holding steady. Typically, we're seeing as well. Really where we're seeing kind of fundraising decline is that kind of the live appeal, right? So the kind of ask during the event, will you give money? We don't have that peer pressure necessarily. We don't have that kind of high energy in the room, right, that maybe we had before. So that we're seeing fundraise about kind of 50% of what it typically would. Not true for every organization. We have organizations we work with who have done their best fundraiser ever during this virtual time. We have others who maybe only raised a third as much. But I will say when they look at their net ROI and how much they kind of netted after expenses, a lot of them, even if they're fundraising way less during the event, actually are doing much better because their costs are so much lower. So whereas before they were buying food, right, and space and caterers and tables and all that type of stuff, now they're basically buying a platform and a production consultant and getting out of this for anywhere from kind of $1,000 to $10,000 at most. So the reduction in cost has actually led to kind of a positive net for their budget. We don't need to advertise these nearly as much as in person, so we definitely could make the announcement we're doing this farther ahead, but really we're not starting a real strong email push to get our audiences to register until kind of 3 to 4 weeks beforehand. And we're really not starting a really strong social media push until kind of 1 to 2 weeks beforehand. So the reason behind that is simply there's less logistics, right? People don't necessarily have to get a sitter. They're not leaving their house. They can attend, in gym shorts, and it takes less planning, right, on people's part. And also just the fact that there's so much information out there, so much uncertainty, so much noise, that if you kind of tell me something happening 8 weeks from now, I'm not going to remember that, right? And no one's planning necessarily 6 or 7 weeks out ahead of time right now. So a shorter advertising window, and just kind of hitting it multiple times in that kind of shorter time. So with that, we're going to get into some specific kind of tips and tricks for these virtual events. And we will have time at the end for questions. So we will leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end to answer questions about some of the things we're going through here. So the first thing to think about for a virtual event is what kind of fundraiser do we want to throw, right? And the important caveat there is it doesn't have to be what we used to do in person. So one of the biggest, I think, mistakes we've seen is folks trying to take exactly what they did in person and move it exactly online. For some of us, that may make sense, but for a lot of us, it just isn't going to work, right? To do exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, simply doing it kind of over webcam. So a few different types of events we could choose from if we're thinking about virtual. A fundraiser, right? So these are those kind of smaller house parties, right, or dinners, and maybe a board member used to host them. We could still possibly do these, right, socially distanced in person, but also we could do these virtually. We've seen folks get together, kind of groups of 10 or 20 people at a time, maybe deliver meals to them, right, from a local restaurant that you create a partnership with. We've seen a lot of good deals there because restaurants are excited for the business, so it's kind of a win-win. Our staff deliver meals to these 15 people on a night, and then maybe we have a couple kind of unique speakers for them. They're able to all watch that through a virtual platform and then have a dialogue with each other, right? Almost kind of like a group dinner. So we've seen some folks do that for recreating that fundraiser in kind of a virtual world. Obviously, if we used to have a gala, try to take that virtual. We have seen people take these virtual, but this is one of those that really typically the format changes quite a bit, right? Galas relied heavily on kind of peer pressure and kind of conversations, right? And a lot of kind of back and forth dialogue happening at the event in addition to the performances on stage. Simply taking that agenda and kind of moving it virtual often isn't going to get the level of engagement we need at our events. So thinking about how can we add in some more back and forth, how can we add in a level of interactivity? And we'll talk about this as some of our tips here in just a second, but making sure we're giving the audience something to do. So I think we have seen some virtual galas go really well for organizations, but those I think really involve some elements of engagement for the audience, making sure we're not just doing kind of a one-way street there. Some type of virtual performance, obviously this is going to cater itself best to our arts organizations out there, but really kind of any organization that maybe has access to some great performers, right, or performance artists. We have seen these work well most of the time with pre-recorded performances that are being exclusively played for the event, just because too much can go wrong with kind of a live performance. But we have seen these pre-recorded performances that are kind of exclusively dropping at the event be something that's engaged audiences. Still making sure we have enough content around it, and still making sure, once again, there's an ask for the audience, right? So it's not just show up to hear this person sing, but there's also something for them to do and engage with. One of the virtual events we've actually seen work best right now are any type of virtual kind of fun runs or virtual walks. That's usually something that a lot of folks don't think about organizing because all the kind of hoops you have to jump through to do that in person. But virtually, there's a lot less. You basically just have to tell people you're doing it, have a waiver form, and kind of set up a site. But we've seen people be really excited by these. And a lot of these virtual fun runs or walks have actually overperformed what they expected. So it's been a mix of folks doing it for the first time and folks taking a traditional in-person and moving it online. Why these have worked so well, donors are really looking for two things right now. They're looking for a sense of impact, right? They want to make a difference because they feel like things are out of their control. They want a sense of community because they feel isolated and they feel like they can't do their typical routine, right? Probably like all of us are feeling as well. So that community and impact is really touched upon when I talk about kind of a virtual fun run. We're all going to run a 5K, even though you're not with the other runners. You know they're across the city, they're across the region, they're across the area. We're all running relatively at the same time. So there's a sense of kind of togetherness there. And folks have really responded well to that opportunity. And then finally, this is usually going to be kind of part of another type of event, right? Not usually its own, but we have seen folks bring online auctions and raffles, right, back into these events. So that's still definitely an option to have as an element of our virtual event as part of our fundraiser. I think the biggest challenge that we've seen this year is just a little harder to get some items donated because a lot of that came from the hospitality industry or local businesses. And obviously both of those are difficult to be asking for things from right now. If we're going virtual, so if we're choosing to not cancel, but to kind of shift to a virtual event, it can be a really good option for both kind of bringing in money if we need it right now and engagement, right? So we do have organizations who are just canceling, just waiting until 2021 to really do a fundraiser. For a lot of those organizations, we're encouraging them to do some type of stewardship event, right? So I want to make sure, even if I don't want to raise money right now, that my audience is staying engaged, right? When I think about that non-monetary goal. So I would encourage folks to think about some type of virtual engagement, even if they're not going to do a virtual fundraiser this year. If you are going virtual with your fundraiser, there's a few things we're seeing. One is that these really still can be successful fundraisers. So again, setting expectations, probably not as successful as our in-person in terms of dollars raised, but when we look at net, a lot of times might even be better than it was before. It can be great for engagement, right? We know stakeholders, once again, are anxious about everything going on, just like we all are, right? Are lonely and isolated in a lot of cases. They want some type of distraction, and that engagement can be a great thing that we can kind of power through our events. It shows that we're being responsive. So one of the big things we're trying to make sure our donors know going into end of year is that we're doing stuff, right? 92% of small nonprofits and medium-sized organizations are either still working in person on the front lines or have shifted their work virtual, right? So the vast majority of organizations are doing things right now. We want donors to know that, and one way is through an event. And then finally, virtual events allow us to be a little bit more creative, right? Because the cost is so much lower, we can maybe engage folks in things we wouldn't have done necessarily before. Donor trivia nights, right? We've seen like work decently well for organizations. Some of these virtual fun runs, right? All these things are things that would have had a pretty good price tag if we had done in person, that now might be available to us, and we may not have kind of seriously considered before. When we think about kind of taking an event virtual, some of the big things we're thinking about is just how we actually going to kind of put it out there, right, and engage the audience. We'll talk about each of these here in a second. For live stream events, this is really, pretty straightforward. The majority of the event is live content, right? So the majority of it's happening in the moment. Has it happened before? Is being filmed kind of in the moment there, live. The benefit of live content at your event is that it definitely increases the level of urgency, right? So if I'm saying like, hey, log in tonight to like hear from this person talking at that time, it just psychologically kind of makes me feel more like a real thing's happening and I need to be there for it, right? Even if I know it's going to be recorded and I can watch it later, I still feel like I might be missing out if I'm not there, right? And it's one of the better options for really creating kind of engagement, right? And kind of engaging content. Some of the downsides, it can be kind of costly to kind of get it set up, right? We want to make sure in this case, we're testing everything, right? We're testing it a lot. We want to make sure our lighting's good, our sound's good, our internet's good. We're going to have a backup or two, right? We typically recommend for whatever live content you have actually 2 levels of backups, right? So if my main speaker internet cuts out and my second speaker gets sick, who's going to speak, right? So making sure we have some contingencies planned there. And for live events, we do see if it's totally live, 100% live. One downside is it does lose a little bit of that legacy appeal. So even if recorded, folks are a little bit less likely to watch it because they feel like they kind of missed it, right? Because it was happening live and they weren't. When we think about recorded events, so this is a majority of the event being recorded content that was pre-recorded, then played at a certain time. A little bit easier for production. We can get a little bit more creative on our design, right? Some of the things we're doing. We can get a little bit more flexible with how we're interacting with the audience, which actually might let us get the closest to our kind of pre-existing event experience. Some of the downsides, a lot of the times to make this pre-recorded content really work and be engaging, we have to use a slightly more complicated platform, which might be harder for our audience. It's a little bit harder to engage folks, right? We can definitely still do it through a really active chat function. It's going to be a little bit more challenging than the live. It's a little harder to evaluate engagement, right? Kind of in the moment. The majority of organizations we see now are doing a blend of these two, kind of 60-40, and I would say the preference or leaning is towards recorded content over live, but still making sure at least kind of a third of it is live. So we want that element of urgency, but the level of preparation we can have with recorded content. And then finally, some folks are kind of choosing to go online for a virtual fundraiser, but kind of blow past kind of all the event styling and just do an online campaign, right? So we used to do a gala, we can't this year. So we are going to try to raise the money kind of during a week-long campaign, right? Or a day-long social media campaign or something like that. Definitely the easiest for you in the audience, right? Not a lot of details to manage there. But at the same time can feel a little bit more transactional, and whatever that secondary goal was, right? So the non-monetary goal, we kind of lose out on. For those live stream events, we won't go too long into this, but the slides will be sent out to you all afterwards, so you'll have those. But we really want to think about the content. So the live events, really content's going to be king here. Making sure we have really engaging speakers. You know, one thing I heard someone say recently I thought was really true is that whoever our host is, right, or our main speaker of these events, is going to have to like be someone with like energy times 10, right? Probably someone who we might have thought was too energetic in person is going to be great for a virtual event, because to really kind of get across the medium and still drive home engagement, excitement, make the audience feel like they're at something kind of real, it takes a lot of entertainment value and a lot of energy there, right? So we want to think carefully about who we're having speak. The only other big thing I would say for live is that there's a lot of testing we want to do, right? Checking kind of a couple weeks ahead of time, but also doing a dress rehearsal kind of a day ahead of time or even morning of, just because we all know Wi-Fi shifts day to day sometimes, right? Folks might get sick, right? You know, folks might have issues kind of with kids in virtual schooling, right? We never know. So it's important to make sure we're kind of testing multiple times, have multiple backups, and make sure multiple people know how to kind of run the platform. If it's pre-recorded, we're thinking about some pre-recorded content for our event. Really thinking about how we're still going to make this engaging, right? So it could be an active chat, could be polls, could be interactive activity, right? It could be that we put them in small breakout rooms and they talk with each other, whatever that may be, but something for them to do at the event, right? We don't want them just to watch pre-recorded videos. It's going to feel not engaging enough for the audience. And one of the big tips we see is, once again, kind of focusing, especially now, more so than kind of early on during COVID, is really focusing on engagement at our virtual events. So using the chat function, we've seen chat actually be really helpful for getting a back and forth, not just between you and participants, but between participants and other participants, which is really the goal, right? So that's kind of the ultimate engagement there. So getting the chat going, I'm using the polls and kind of direct questions to the audience to again get some participation. And then really challenging participants to do something at home, right? It could be something fun, like we're going to send 3 different cocktail recipes ahead of time, right? And we encourage you to kind of make one and send us kind of a selfie, right? It could be an actual task kind of related to the social work we do, right? So an environmental organization, and we want you to kind of, set up a home recycling program this week, or, do X, Y, or Z. But giving them actions, right? So once again, we don't want this to feel transactional, like we're just getting them on camera to ask them for money. So we want to make sure we're kind of giving them something else to engage with. Some type of surprise. A lot of times when we say things like this, it sounds expensive. Doesn't have to be. Just something that people aren't going to expect, right? So we've seen some folks mail invitations, and as silly as that sounds, getting an in-paper mailed invitation to your virtual event makes it seem a lot more real, right, and a lot more tangible. Probably not that expensive. So doing something small like that can be really, really effective. Staying really focused at the event. Virtual events, I think more so than in person, it feels like we can do anything, and that is both freeing but also paralyzing in some ways. So it's important to make sure we're staying focused on kind of the message, because we want to make sure we're being concise. So typically, we see these events kind of max out at 90 minutes. After that, it's really hard to keep people engaged. We're not seeing events go much shorter than 45 or 60, and in most cases, 60 minutes. Just because any shorter than that doesn't really feel like a real event, right? It just feels kind of like a webinar. So somewhere in that kind of 60 to 90 minutes range is typically kind of the sweet spot right now for length overall. Again, giving the audience a task, a choice, a role, right? There's two different, speakers you can watch. Which one do you want to watch, right? You can choose your own breakout room, answer the poll, right? Chat a question answer, that type of thing to give them something to do. And some type of ownership over it. And then again, kind of practicing this ahead of time. I think because it's virtual, some folks feel like they can just kind of get on there and start talking, and definitely understand, but really easy to kind of then just start talking about everything, right? And hard to kind of stay on time and stay on schedule. So thinking about how to kind of practice that ahead of time. Two things we want to avoid. We don't want it to just be a bunch of talking heads, right, or pre-recorded videos talking at the audience. And we want to be okay with the fact that this isn't going to be perfect, right? It's not going to be exactly the same as in person. There might be some type of hiccup, right? But folks are pretty forgiving right now, right? So we want it overall to run smoothly. We want to be prepared, but we also want to be kind of okay with where we're at right now, the flexibility that requires. And then finally, it's really important to kind of follow up after the virtual fundraiser right now, right? So especially because it's virtual, it's easy for folks, this is true in person as well, but definitely kind of virtually, to kind of go to it, get excited by it, and then kind of forget it by the time they go to bed, right? And best case, maybe they forget it a couple days later. So we want to make sure we're kind of wrapping around the communication there and keeping them engaged, especially because end of year is going to be either during or right on the heels of our events. So we'll make sure we're saying thank you, sending kind of a personalized thank you letter to them, and following up sometime in the first week. We want to debrief with our team, especially if we're thinking about a future fundraiser. So if we have a spring fundraiser, or pretty much any type of fundraiser before probably July of next year, there's a chance that it may or not be virtual. So making sure we capture some lessons learned here, that probably would impact our event, whether it's in person or not. So we're going to end here on end of year tips. And before we go into some of the specific tips here in just a second, we're going to do another poll quickly and just ask a little bit how you're feeling going into end of year. So do you think this year is going to be better, worse, about the same as last year, or unsure? So just take a second, vote there, look at those results. As we're waiting for those results to come in, I'll say in general, when we talk to our partners in a recent survey of small nonprofits, 60% were unsure, right? So a lot of folks have a lot of uncertainty about this end of year for a lot of reasons that make a lot of sense. And then about 30% felt kind of the same as last year or slightly better. And then about 10%, 20% felt like it was going to be worse this year. So here it's looking like a lot of folks are kind of feeling end of year is going to be worse, within about, about 30%, again, kind of about the same or better. So yeah, so when we look at end of year overall, I'll say we actually expect, again, when we think about those trends we were talking about earlier, a lot of our major donors have still come through, right? So if our major donors give at end of year, we still expect a lot of them to give at end of year. One of the biggest areas I think is going to be difficult is acquisition. We'll talk about that in a second, but donor acquisition is really hard right now. During a crisis, during crisis fundraising, typically, folks give to organizations they already know in most cases, right? Because when we're scared, when times are uncertain, we turn to things we know, and fundraising is no different. So acquisition's a little slow this year. So when I think about end of year, that's one of the big things is it might not be getting as many new people in the door. And then for those other donors, one of the big things that's going to shift it is our engagement prior to the ask, right? So the more we can do some stewardship virtual events, the more we can kind of make sure we have some updates out there. Really important. So kind of with that level of urgency around end of year, I'll talk about 4 quick tips that we see are helping organizations kind of prep and plan for a definitely uncertain season of giving. First and foremost, we want to shift our ask, but we're not kind of reinventing the wheel here, right? So when we think about our actual solicitation, why would people support us? The mission's still the same, right? So even if we're doing drastically different work, the why behind why we do it is probably roughly the same, right? People want to give to us probably for roughly the same reason as before. If they really loved our work because they believe in educational equality, and that's the type of work we say we're doing, they probably still believe in educational equality during and after the pandemic, right? And everything else going on. So it's really important that that core part of why you should support us is probably going to stay roughly the same, right? So we want that part, the kind of vision, the mission to be kind of consistent. We're going to focus though on everything around that core part, being some shifting context and clarity for why people should engage right now. One of the things we want to make sure it's in our pitch, in our kind of appeal letter during end of year giving, is the context of what this has meant for the organization and the clients we serve, right? So we want to add some urgency. So as I said earlier, kind of 92% of small and medium-sized nonprofits are still doing great work right now, and active work, I should say. And over 80% surveyed are having financial challenges, right? So we know there's a lot of urgency and a lot of good quality out there. How we kind of get ours to rise above, right? And kind of engage with our donors and kind of cut through the noise a bit. Is really making sure we're talking about either the new needs of our clients, right? Maybe new challenges have arisen because of everything going on. Maybe pre-existing issues are worse now, right? Because of everything going on, or new challenges for the organization. And for many of us, it might be all 3. But talking about those to add a level of urgency, right, to what we're doing and explaining that. The other thing I think is really important to consider when thinking about our end of year appeal is just providing some clarity, right? So talking about the pivot we've made, how our work is different. But one of the big things we've been telling folks to think about is that, if you're an after school provider, before you even told me anything about your curriculum or what major organization is so special, right, or so incredible, if you just told me like we run an after school program, I sort of know what that means, right? I can visualize it because like I was in an after school program, kids are in an after school program, right? You kind of have a sense of what's happening. But if instead you're saying, well, we're running virtual Zoom learning sessions for students, right? Or we're doing like virtual practice or something, I may not really know what that means, right? It's harder for me to visualize. We have to rely a bit more on stories this year to paint that picture, because the donor is not going to support something they don't understand. So it's really important we're kind of going back to square one a bit and how we talk about our work to paint that picture and connect the dots for folks to let them know that we're either in person because we're providing basic needs, but we're doing so safely, or we're virtual, and here's what that actually means. Second thing, when kind of planning ahead, Giving Tuesday, one of the big things we've seen in fundraising is peer-to-peer has actually been really effective during COVID. So if you think back to what I said about acquisition being really hard, during times of stress and uncertainty, we turn to people we know, and that's also true in giving, right? So we're not necessarily turning to new organizations, but we're turning to our friends, right, for recommendations on how to make a difference. And then we're giving there. So Giving Tuesday with a peer-to-peer focus can be really effective this year. In December, really focusing on kind of doubling down on sending at least kind of 3 to 5 emails in December because it is going to be a slightly truncated giving season because of the election. So it's important that we're kind of doubling down there. Even if we're starting early in kind of mid-October, December is still going to be a time of heavy action and we want to make sure we're getting our voice out there. And then finally, a lot of folks are making the decision that basically the week before, during, and after the election, people are not going to be paying attention to anything else. And that would typically be a time a lot of folks are starting their end of year campaign. So either starting it early in mid-October or in kind of mid-late November. But we're seeing more people choose and are kind of leaning towards recommending that early start. So even if it's not necessarily an ask yet, but you're telling people about your end of year campaign and the theme and getting the information out there, getting it out early so then you can have people recall it after the election instead of learn about it after the election can be one thing to help for engagement there. We don't want to wait till December to launch because it's hard then to kind of get attention for it. And we don't want to just, some people I think are kind of being silent, right, or trying not to send out too much stuff or fatigue our donors. But time and time again, we see in crisis fundraising, those organizations that keep asking are the ones that do the best. And then finally, the other thing we'll say just regarding the election rate, we've had a lot of questions about that on the impact of fundraising. Then we'll wrap up here in just a second and start taking some questions. Regardless of the outcome, it could lead donors to be more or less engaged, right? Either because they're optimistic or fearful or whatever, but regardless of how they feel about the outcome, it's really hard to say yet if they're going to be giving more or less, right? One of the biggest things we're worried about in the fundraising space that if it's unclear, contested, and kind of goes on for several weeks into mid-November or late November, that's going to make it that much harder for us to get attention for our causes and for end of year. So having a flexible plan. So we're really encouraging people to have a plan, have a frame for when we want to communicate, what's the core of our message, right? What's the core of our solicitation, but being kind of flexible, trying to wait on our direct mailings, right, until after the election, because the tone of our letter and the kind of details and intro and things like that might shift a bit depending on what happens November 3rd. And in general, planning for slightly less attention than normal, again, the week before, during, and after the election. With that, some final just quick tips. We have seen online auctions work better than expected, I think. So considering that as part of your virtual event, making sure we're asking people to do something, even if it's as small as like posting a picture, right, or sending us, a picture or something, but asking them to do something at the event. Really trying to drive comments and chat. That's one of the more successful ways we've seen folks engage people at their virtual events. Giving audience members some opportunity of choice, right, of what panel to attend, right, or speaker to hear, or generate some content ahead of time, but doing something. Remembering that they're probably at home with their family. So if we can add a family-friendly element to it, the better engagement we're going to see. And then finally, gamify, which is just a fancy way of saying add something fun to it, right? So something that they, a challenge, right, a task, an activity, a game, but something that they can kind of participate in. With that, we'll switch to taking some questions.
Well, thank you, Matt. Some great content there, and we have a number of different questions that have come in. I think you've touched on many of these, but it'll give you maybe a chance to reiterate some points and expand a little bit. So the first question we have is, have you seen anything go wrong at in-person events so far? Our board is split on whether or not to do any fundraising events or / get-togethers in person.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the potential is obviously there, right? And a lot of organizations are worried about that, both because they want to be responsible and also because of liability. So I would say the vast majority of organizations we're seeing not choose to do kind of any in-person anything. And if they are, it's usually folks that already know each other. So it's that kind of small fundraiser model where they're kind of already all friends, right? And they're agreeing to socially distance together. But because of the responsibility and liability piece, we're not seeing many people go that direction.
Next question. Do you have any recommendations for online auction platforms for small organizations?
Yeah, there's a few out there. I'm trying to think of. I think One Cause is one of them, and Give Lively is another that comes to mind. It really depends on if we want one-stop shop that's going to kind of do our whole event, right? Ticketing, post the video, do the auction, or if we want to get a few different platforms and put together. And that's largely going to depend on our staff time and if we're bringing in a consultant or not. But really thinking about, do we want one thing to do everything, or just an auction platform? So you're going to find very different results there.
Great, thanks. One more question here. Don't you think virtual fundraising is here to stay and may become the main method in the future?
Yeah, I think especially for events, it's going to be more, before it was a rarity, it's definitely going to be common moving forward. I think for a lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations, thinking about how much they spent on an in-person gala, right, and food, and and as we said, right, the least effective way to raise a dollar in fundraising. Even though a lot of organizations had successful events, we spent a lot of money to make those events successful. I don't see organizations going back to that anytime soon or at the high level it was. But I do think people are going to be looking for in-person engagement. So late 2021, I think there'll be some opportunities for some medium-sized events that maybe we haven't done before.
Yeah. We do have a couple questions about engagement. What are some of the best activities you've seen some organizations incorporate into their virtual galas to create an opportunity for interaction among those attendees? And I know you kind of touched on that in one of your slides. The other one that I'll add into this, since it's kind of along the same lines, how long should an online fundraiser be? You said engagement is important, and it's hard to keep people engaged online for very long outside of Netflix or Facebook, smiley face.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, so you can always just play the Netflix film, right? But no, typically 90 minutes at most, and kind of 45 or 60 at minimum. Shorter than that, while engaging, doesn't necessarily feel like a full event. Longer than 90 minutes, it's really hard to get people to stay active, right, and just stay focused. So that would be kind of the time window, I would say. And I think what determines if it's more 60 or 90 is just the level of activities you have, right, and speakers and engagement. When we talk about engagement at the event, asking really direct questions. So asking people to respond in the chat to, have you experienced this, right? Or what are you seeing from other organizations, or what are you most concerned about right now? Like asking questions you think are going to provoke a response, and hopefully, and having a staff person dedicated to just facilitating the chat. So that should be someone's whole role at the event, and trying to respond to those chats, try to get people to chat to each other, right? So that's one thing. We've seen some folks use breakout rooms. It depends on your audience, the theme of your event. But sometimes using those smaller groups, people are a lot more comfortable talking, either by unmuting or chatting in a small group than a big group. And then in terms of kind of games that have been going on, we've seen folks do trivia. We've seen folks do, virtual kind of scavenger hunt for facts and things like that. So there's a lot of, once again, depends on our issue, not going to be appropriate for everyone, but some really creative ideas out there about how to kind of gamify.
Yeah. And specific to breakout rooms, we just had a question come in and said, what's your view on using those to engage participants? Sounds like it's an option for some organizations, but there is that potential for it to, also fall flat depending on who's in that breakout room and how that's kind of handled.
And I would say you kind of have to have a good moderator for each one, right? So we have to think about, do we have enough folks to kind of staff this well and make sure that conversation is staying kind of lively. And in terms of the number of folks, we actually see engagement be best at the kind of anywhere from kind of 5 to 10, but capping at around 14.
Sure. All right, thanks. A couple of questions about kind of a traditional mail appeal. One is, our supporters are relatively low tech. Do you have any predictions for mailed appeals this year?
Yeah, so far we've seen direct mail perform better than usual. And I mean, it's always strong. It's one of the most effective ways to fundraise typically. But this year, especially because there's less junk mail coming out there, right? We're getting less stuff in our mailboxes. And we have so much screen time that kind of in real life feeling is definitely real. So people are being able to hold on to something. And using that for stewardship and or solicitation has been effective for folks. So we definitely recommend.
Jessica asks, do you have any recommendations for direct mail appeals in terms of formatting? Is the traditional letter still seen as successful, or do you recommend something more creative?
Yeah, so I think a letter is always going to be strong, but I think what we're seeing a lot of times now is folks add, some photos in there, right? Or maybe the client a client made kind of thank you or something. We see a lot of folks that work with kids add like, a kid's drawing in there, right, or a thank you note or something. Maybe there's a separate impact story vignette on a second page. Maybe it's a little smaller so you can tell it's not a 2-page document, right, because no one wants to read that. But keeping a letter to 1 page, adding something else creative in there a lot of times can be really engaging for the donor.
This question says, we have some board members that are reluctant to ask for money right now from our donors. What would you say to them?
Yeah, so this is a big thing with crisis fundraising in general, right? And especially kind of, the same thing happened in 2008 with the recession. How can I go out there and ask for money when I know people are hurting, when I know it's a challenging environment for folks? The biggest thing I'd say is, one, the organizations we saw that be most successful and survive the 2008 recession were those that kept asking. The other thing I would say is that we see a lot of individual donors want to give right now, right? There are definitely going to be people in our networks who, because of personal circumstances, just can't, right? But we're not necessarily seeing people be offended by the ask rate if they've supported us before. And we're seeing a lot of folks step up. People are really desperate to feel a sense of control and impact right now. And one way they can do that is participating. So I think framing it to the board, this is giving folks just the opportunity to engage.
The final question that we've received is, what approaches have you seen, or what recommendations do you have about Giving Tuesday, about doing a Giving Tuesday campaign and also a traditional year-end mail campaign?
Definitely. Yeah. So we typically see Giving Tuesday at this point is well known enough that it kind of acts as its own holiday a bit. And actually it's close in a lot of ways to disaster fundraising. And why I say that is because it doesn't lower other giving. So if someone gives me $50 on Giving Tuesday, they still typically will donate like they would at end of year. So it doesn't necessarily lead to the donor fatigue that I think a lot of people are sometimes worried about. This year, especially, we see Giving Tuesday as a good peer-to-peer opportunity where I'm getting some, possibly my volunteers who can't volunteer in person, my donors who want to be engaged, they can't give more right now because of economic reasons, activating those folks to ask their friends to give small amounts, right? And this is exactly what we see work well in kind of difficult economic times. We're trying to solicit gifts, are those small gifts that we're focusing on the collective power, right? That sense of community. So definitely something that we're seeing a lot of organizations consider this year, and we would recommend.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, that was the final question we have. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thank you all for having me. I think the biggest thing we would say is be flexible with yourself, right? Understand this is a really stressful time for you and your staff. So set some kind of high level goals and kind of make a flexible plan going into it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Matt. We really appreciate it. This is a fantastic session, and we appreciate also everyone who joined us today. As we mentioned earlier, we're going to be following up this session with the recording as well as an evaluation, so you can give us your feedback, and we'll also share Matt's slide deck. We encourage you all to visit dcmp.org, follow us on Facebook for upcoming trainings and opportunities, to sign up for our newsletter. Our next webinar is going to be a lot of fun. It's on October 20th, and we will be welcoming in 3 local nonprofit professionals from Safe Passage and the Egyptian Theater, who are going to be talking about communication strategies in this new era that we find ourselves in. And those are 2 organizations that are really doing a great job in terms of communication. So we hope you'll join us for that. You can find more information about it on our website and register for that today. So once again, thank you all for attending. And a big thank you goes to Matt Gayer for sharing his time and expertise with all of us today. Thanks again, and take care.